So next we have the Lead Safe and Water panel, which Taylor will be the moderator. Taylor is the health policy manager at Women for a Healthy Environment. She is the lead at Women for Healthy Environment Coalition building and advocacy initiatives around issues such as childhood lead poisoning and radon in schools. Taylor is passionate about community-driven change and policy solutions to improve the well-being of people and the environments by dismantling system of oppressions. She is adamant about our zip code should not be determined by our health. Before moving to Pittsburgh in 2019, she spent the beginning of her career as a community organizer in grassroots campaigns related to healthy, affordable housing and anti-displacement. She is the graduate of Calvin College, now Calvin University, CSWE accredited Bachelor in Social Work program in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So here we have next is Taylor.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shavesha, and what an amazing, amazing panel. And thank you for all of your work and for leading us through such an insightful discussion.
Yes, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And, as you can tell, we are in the presence of really incredible, dedicated leaders, both within our region and our nation. And that's just the beginning. So we're going to enter into our next panel, which is focused on lead-safe drinking water very specifically. We hit a couple of topics related to this in the EJ panel previously, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this topic, followed by a couple other community discussions. And so I wanted to start us out today on the Lead Safe Water panel by spending some time kind of doing some overview of lead and water in Allegheny County and what this looks like for us locally. And then we'll follow that by some great information from two national leaders on both advocacy and lead and water and best practices around solving that issue. And then we'll hear from two local amazing leaders who can really speak to how do we make this and the solutions a reality on the ground. So if you are able to pull up my slides, we can start there. Perfect. So earlier this year, Women for a Healthy Environment released two different reports, and this first one was taking a look at Allegheny County community water systems across the county. And so just to give a little bit of a snapshot of what we're talking about today in this discussion, wanted to run through a couple of the findings that we found when we studied all 36 community water systems in our county. And so first of all, there are so many, and so that leads to a lot of discussion around collaboration and resource sharing and where residents can go or not go to get information. But when you look at lead very in particular, we found that 80% of the community water systems in our county had detectable levels of lead according to their 2019 reports. That 36 or about a little over a third of these water systems share information about lead on their websites. 12% have confirmed that they have lead service line inventory, so knowing where they are and where the harm might exist. And then almost a third of them offer testing services, but many of those do come with a cost. And so what you see below here is a pie chart outlining kind of where the lead levels are locally. And I will say, while this is a local discussion, this often represents what you see across the nation. But going back to this pie chart, you see that, there are 60% are between, undetectable to about 10 parts per billion. And we'll explain kind of what those levels mean in a little bit. And then 14% are between 10 and 15. 20% are undetectable, and then about 3 were above 15, and one of those being a story that we'll hear about today and how those levels have come down since 2019. So next slide, please. Great. And I won't go through these numbers in detail, but this is just to kind of show you a little preview again of what's happening at a local level related to lead service line replacements in our communities. And so what we show here on the left are water systems within the county that are conducting what we call partial lead line replacements, meaning just the portion of the lead service line from the street to about your sidewalk is replaced. And if the lead line from your sidewalk to your home is left intact. And that's a practice we're going to speak a little bit more about today that's can actually negatively impact health and increase lead levels. And then to the right is water systems and the number of replacements they've done since 2015 to replace those full service lines. Next slide, please. Great. And then the water report that I referred to called Something's in the Water. These are just some of the key recommendations that came out of that. So first, needing to boost collaboration, especially given that we have 36 different systems all doing the same service across the county. The need for better consumer education and providing resources, but also knowledge of lead and these issues among groups such as the board of directors or leadership within the water system. Having public health representation on boards and improving internal record keeping, building lead line inventories and increasing capacity in general. And then lastly, and really importantly, making sure every time we replace a lead service line, we replace the whole thing. Next slide, please. Great. And the last thing I was going to mention is that, when we think about water, we're not just thinking about the taps in our homes. We're also thinking about another place that children spend a lot of time, in fact, around 1,000 hours a year, and that's in schools and early learning centers. And so a report that we produced related to the environmental health in Pennsylvania schools looked at 65 schools, a representative sample of all of our school districts, and found that the average age of a PA school is 57 years old, and that of the schools that we talked to, 89% of those districts tested drinking water for lead in the last 10 years. And of those, 91% had detectable levels, and only 9% reported taking remediation action. And so this is all to just give a snapshot of where we are, what we're working with, and what the scope of the issue looks like here. But now I would love to turn to our first panelist, Jana Limbrunadu, who can come to the stage as I introduce her. And she is an affiliate faculty at the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech, and co-founder of the Campaign for Lead-Free Water. She served on the EPA National Drinking Water Advisory Council, Lead and Copper Rule Work Group, and filed the group's sole dissenting opinion. She also served as an advisor to the Policy Committee of former Michigan Governor Snyder's Flint Water Interagency Coordinating Committee, which developed the foundation for Michigan's landmark lead and copper rule. She has been working on lead in the U.S. In drinking water for 14 years. And with that, I will pass it over to Jana.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Taylor. And thank you for this really fantastic introduction to what's happening in Pittsburgh with lead and water. And good morning, everybody. I really want to thank for hosting this important event, and the previous panel I thought was just so fantastic and inspiring. I'm honored to be here today. So I'll take a few minutes to highlight some common myths about lead in drinking water, and if we can start with the slides, that would be really great. These myths are disseminated by institutions with authority on matters of health, and unfortunately have stood in the way of informed decision-making and the development of policies that would better protect public health. The first myth is that the most widespread and hazardous sources of lead are lead-based paint and lead-contaminated dust. In reality, and I think Taylor, as you suggested, and if we can, right. So in reality, and in contrast to lead paint and dust, lead-bearing plumbing is present in almost every US building. Water flowing through such plumbing is ingested regularly by people of all ages, directly or through food. Specifically, leaded brass can be found pretty much everywhere. Lead solder can be found in about 81 million homes. And lead service lines, which are made of 100% pure lead, it's anyone's guess, but current estimates range between 6 and over 10 million. The second myth is that lead-contaminated water is really only a minor or secondary source of lead poisoning in children. In reality, sources of lead can vary significantly from case to case. They depend on each child's environment and on each child's specific interactions with their environment. And these interactions, of course, can change over time. So a fetus, an infant dependent on reconstituted formula, a toddler, and a 6-year-old tend to interact with their environments quite differently. The lead and copper rule, and Suzanne will be talking about this in just a few minutes, states that as little as 5% to more than 50% of children's total lead exposure can come from water, and that infants dependent on reconstituted formula may receive more than 85% of their total lead from drinking water. Studies have also shown that lead from water can actually be the dominant source of exposure in children. Reasons why we routinely underestimate water's significance include that lead in water can actually be really hard to detect. That's because lead in water appears in dissolved form, like sugar in hot tea, but also in the form of particles. These are small pieces of pure lead, as well as leaded solder, brass, or rust that tend to release erratically. They can be hard to catch through standard testing methods because they really operate like a Russian roulette. So the photo of the aerator screen that you see on the bottom left of the slide is from a kitchen tap of a child in North Carolina who was lead poisoned from food that was cooked with contaminated tap water. The second reason why we routinely underestimate water's significance is because we rarely screen the two populations who are most vulnerable to lead in water: fetuses and infants dependent on reconstituted formula. And when we do diagnose children with elevated blood lead levels, we conduct environmental risk assessments in their homes that tend to center on lead paint, dust, and soil. Water is either not sampled at all, or when it is sampled, it is usually sampled inadequately. The third myth is that lead service lines are, as a rule, the main and only source of lead in water, and that getting your water tested will tell you if it's safe to drink. In reality, although lead service lines pose a significant risk to human health and must be fully replaced, other lead-bearing plumbing materials can cause contamination as well. Here, for example, you can see a city like Portland, Oregon, with no lead service lines, but with chronic lead in water problems nevertheless. And as attractive as testing may be, because of lead's Russian roulette nature, a tap might need to be sampled many times to detect contamination, which is not how we usually test for lead in water. We usually just take one sample. The fourth myth is that blood lead testing will tell us if a child is being exposed to lead in water. In reality, because the half-life of lead in blood is only 20 to 30 days, a child's blood lead level may peak long before the time of the child's screening. This means that blood lead level results can fail to capture a child's erratic exposures to lead particles and acute elevations of lead in blood in the past. So how we understand lead in water matters, because it can mean the difference between health protective and non-health protective policies and actions. For more information about lead in drinking water, please feel free to visit the Campaign for Lead-Free Water online and to contact me at any time. And I thank you and really look forward to answering any questions and hearing your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yana. I think that lead in water is something that we've definitely heard of and has become quite prevalent in public discourse. But I think it's really important to spend the time to dispel those myths that we often hear about lead exposure through water and drinking water. So now I'd like to bring up one more presenter to kind of tee up our conversation, and that is Suzanne Novak. And she will join us to give an overview of the multi-year process to revise the federal lead and copper rule, which is really that rule that impacts all of the elements that we've been discussing around the lead levels in water and what water authorities have to do to protect communities, and talk about ways that the revisions may help, but also in the ways that it may fall short and what we can do to improve that rule. And so to introduce Suzanne, she's a senior attorney at Earthjustice's Northeast Regional Office, and she focuses on drinking water related matters. And for the last 2 years, she is engaged in litigation and other advocacy concerning recent changes to the federal lead and copper rule. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. So I want to echo Yana that I'm so happy to be here today, and appreciate you asking me to serve on this panel. And I also listened to the earlier panels and thought they were excellent and very inspiring. So I'm happy to be here. So I am going to talk a little bit about how the federal government regulates lead in drinking water, and I'm going to kind of fly through it. It's the lead and copper rule is an extremely complex rule. We will certainly have time for questions afterwards, so just be prepared. I'm going to be giving you a lot of information. Thank you. Can we have the first slide, please? Okay, so there are two main federal laws that regulate water. I just want to tell you the difference between them. The first is the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Water Act regulates the sources of water, where much of our drinking comes from, like lakes and rivers. And then there's the Safe Drinking Water Act, which regulates water in the drinking water distribution system, in an effort to ensure that it's safe to drink it from the tap. And so the Safe Drinking Water Act is what we're going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. Okay, and under the Safe Drinking Water Act, there's two different ways that contaminants are regulated. One is by a maximum contaminant level, or an MCL, and the other is through a treatment technique. An MCL is the maximum level of a contaminant that is allowed in a water delivered to any user of a public water system, and exceeding it is a violation. This is a very straightforward way of regulating it. You can't have more than X amount of a certain contaminant in water, and if it's over that amount, then it's a violation. But that's not how lead is regulated. That's how most contaminants are regulated. Lead is regulated through what's known as a treatment technique, and that is a required process that water systems must follow in an effort to reduce the level of a contaminant in drinking water. And it's failing to follow the process, which is a violation. So for lead, it's not a violation no matter how high lead levels are in someone's drinking water. It only matters whether a process was followed. And under the Safe Drinking Water Act, a treatment technique must prevent known or anticipated adverse effects on the health of persons to the extent feasible. And as I'll discuss going forward, that is not what the current lead and copper rule, or LCR, does. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through some components of the lead and copper rule, and then talk about ways that I and others, Yana and many partners around the country, have been advocating to change it. So the first is that the way that testing is done, it is tap water samples are taken from an extremely small percentage of sites in the water system. So for example, in New York City, the water system serves 8 million homes, and they sample 100 sites. Sometimes, often this sampling is done only once every 3 years, and it's done in a way that does not capture the highest levels of lead. So as Yana explained, lead is very variable. It could vary in the same tap within a day greatly. And then here we have tests that are done only once every 3 years in a small number of sites, and that is extrapolated for the entire system. And then corrective action, which consists of corrosion control and lead service line replacement, is required only when more than 10% of those samples have lead levels above 15 parts per billion, which is known as the lead action level. And there were revisions passed under the Trump administration, and those revisions would slow down the rate of lead service line replacements that would happen after that 15 part per billion lead action level is reached. The old LCR requires replacement at 7% per year, whereas the new revisions would require it at 3% per year. And also when you do corrosion control, when a water system is required to do corrosion control, they're only required to get it down to 10 parts per billion, where as we know, there's no safe level of lead in drinking water. So action is only required when 10% of the homes hit 15 parts per billion, which is so much higher than is safe. And I think, as Taylor mentioned, lead is very prevalent in drinking water in schools. Schools have unique characteristics that make it even more prevalent. And the new revisions regulate lead in drinking water, but it's a toothless system that is mostly voluntary, doesn't require notification, and doesn't require remediation when lead levels are found. The lead and copper rule also has no major public education component and permits water systems to mislead the public by having gobbledygook of discussion about lead action levels and compliance with the LCR that the general public doesn't necessarily understand, and allows administration officials to put out statements saying your water is safe, it's safe to drink, even when it's not. Next slide, please. So because of this, many of us have been working to advocate for changes to the EPA to establish a prevention-oriented approach to stop exposure to lead in water instead of relying on faulty testing, get lead service lines out of the ground, incentivize filters, certified filters, and have a comprehensive public education campaign so people understand the dangers that Jana spoke about a few minutes ago. We're advocating for speedy and equitable replacement of lead service lines for all systems. Currently, water systems often require homeowners to pay for replacement on their property, and that leads to a two-tiered system, which is wealthier people have more protection than others. And we've been pushing for better detection of lead by requiring sampling that, as Jana mentioned, right now it doesn't capture the highest levels, just to do it better so we know what the lead levels are, to lower the lead action level to no higher than 5 parts per billion and make it as low as can be, and require optimized corrosion control to also minimize lead to the extent possible, not just to 10 parts per billion. Incentivize schools and childcare centers to adopt a filter first program and not just rely on testing, and to implement comprehensive public education about the harms of lead, the limits of the LCR, and how people can protect their families. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suzanne. You and Jana both have a way of taking really complicated, long documents and very complicated science and explaining it in a very accessible way. So I really appreciate both of you taking the time to detail both opportunities for action and improvement in policy and practice, but also understanding the issue at hand in general. So before we bring everyone back, I wanted to turn to our third panelist, which is Will Pickering, to discuss his experiences with the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority. So if I can invite him to come to the stage. He was named the Chief Executive Officer of the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority in June of 2020. And prior to becoming CEO, he served as the Deputy Executive Director and Director of Public Affairs at PWSA. And prior to joining PWSA in fall of 2016, he was the Manager of Communications and Government Relations communications at DC Water. And there he managed the communications program and spearheaded DC's water interactions with the federal, district, and neighboring local governments. Mr. Pickering has also held several positions in the local and federal government and has a Bachelor of Science in Political Science from Santa Clara University and received a certificate in public management from George Washington University. Welcome, Will.
Great to be here, Taylor, and honored to join this panel and the larger discussion. So really excited to talk about PWSA's issues with lead in water and how we have evolved. I joined PWSA, like you said, in 2016 at a time where we very publicly had exceeded the lead action level, not long after the crisis in Flint was headline news nationally. And there were a number of different obvious solutions, but getting the organization to be able to respond in a way that takes into consideration everything Jana and Suzanne presented today was no easy feat and took us a number of years. I am proud of the program that we have today. It's far from perfect. There is a lot of nuance, and we're constantly evolving and learning from other communities on what they are doing and stealing their good ideas. But I think just to put things in perspective for PWSA and our water service territory, which covers most of Pittsburgh, although we don't provide drinking water to every home in the city of Pittsburgh, is that we exceeded that lead action level that Suzanne walked through of 15 parts per billion. And that required us to undertake a number of different programs. One, we needed to find out where the lead lines were. And we were a system that had old records on paper that oftentimes were over 100 years old and therefore inaccurate. So we needed to take the data that we did have on paper, put it in an easily accessible format. We have a lead service line map that is now available to the public. So everything that we have in terms of record of whether or not a property has lead, we share that with our customers. The second part was developing a replacement program. And at the time in 2016, we were operating under a legal opinion that we couldn't use ratepayer funds to replace the private side of the service line. And Suzanne touched on that sort of tiered, if you go with that philosophy or that regime, and PWSA's only responsibility is the public side. If you have the money to replace the private side at the same time, we can help you there. You really end up with an inequitable program. And we were facing a mandate that we needed to replace nearly 1,400 lead service lines in a year. And we were having a difficulty getting that much interest from anyone to pay out of pocket. And that's not factoring in what we know about the health consequences of just eliminating half of that service line and leaving the private side in place. You're really not gaining all that much ground. We're checking the box from a regulatory framework, but we're not helping customers. So we were able to get a change, or at least a clarification in state law, that we could use our ratepayer dollars to replace that entire service line when we got the homeowner to agree to it. And that really allowed us to be successful in replacing the number of lead service lines that we were required to under the lead and copper rule. That still took a lot of public education, and we needed to build trust with our customers to allow us to go in their homes and do that work. The other side, so we have the finding out where the lead is, replacing it. And I know there's a panel later on today where Dan Duffy, our program manager, who's much smarter and better on the details of that program, will go through. But the other side is treatment. And it was obvious, because we had exceeded the lead action level, that we weren't providing the level of treatment that we needed to for our customers who have lead service lines. And so it did take some testing and regulatory approval, but we're now using orthophosphate, which is a treatment additive that's used across the country to help minimize the contact that water flows through the lead pipe. But as we've talked about, that is not the long-term solution. The long-term solution is doing everything we can from a utility perspective of removing that lead from the system and removing that risk that we have seen in PWSA's data. It's quite variable. You could have two homes right next door to each other that both have lead service lines. And when you go out and do that test, you can have wildly different results. So we are an example of what Jana and Suzanne have presented, And that is one of the reasons why PWSA has embraced that there is no safe level of lead. We're going to do everything we can with the resources that we have to remove that risk from the service line, which is our portion of the puzzle. So and I've talked a lot here, and I know there are other folks who want to join this panel. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. And thanks again for having the opportunity to tell PWSA's story.
Thank you so much, Will. And, as highlighted in his story, we're lucky and honored to have a model for other authorities to follow suit. And so we know that it started in a crisis when we exceeded the federal lead and copper rule, but it's incredible the leaps and bounds that have been made since then, and the great ways that both practices have been improved, but also community engagement. And that last part is something that we'll turn to in thinking about how water authorities can better integrate community engagement and community concerns and education into their work. And so thank you, Will. We'll come back to you, but I'm going to turn to our next guest is Ashley Comans, and she's going to speak to another water authority that was already brought up in the EJ panel by Natisha and others, titled Wilkinsburg Penn Joint Water Authority. And so, unlike PWSA, who's been honing their practices for the last 5 years around lead poisoning prevention, this is an authority that's really just starting to step into that role, and they service 22 communities within the county and around 44,000 households. So this will make a big impact on the county. And they did recently just receive $9.3 million to replace around 1,000 lines. And there has been some recent organizing around this that Ashley will speak to. But to introduce Ashley formally, she is a passionate community advocate who believes it is on us to create the spaces, narratives, and work towards the outcomes we want to see in our community. And she's a resident of Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, just outside the limits of Pittsburgh, who has formerly served on the Wilkinsburg School Board. And most recently, she has been working with organizers regarding the open petition to the Wilkinsburg Penn Joint Water Authority and hopes to ensure residents have access to public, safe, and affordable water. She serves as the vice chair and Catapult Greater Pittsburgh, and is also a board member for Unite and Pittsburgh Urban Magnet Project. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Ashley. If you don't mind sharing a little bit more about your organizing work in this service area related to lead poisoning, and then what concerns are you hearing, among your neighbors? And as actions are taking place, what are people talking about, and what do you think is to come?
So thank you so much, Taylor. This morning so far has really just been encouraging, to say the least, especially the panel before this that I was watching. So for me, my involvement with what's happening in the Wilkinsburg Penn Joint Water Authority, specifically, one, because I'm a ratepayer, but also just as a resident who really cares about issues that are impacting our young people, our families, and just residents overall who are not either aware with what's happening. And I've heard a lot of people talk about it's about the education and bringing the conversation to the people who are responsible and capable of doing something about it. So I've really heard about this from my former work with the Alliance for Police Accountability, as well as Pittsburgh United. And they were just informing me that there was organizing happening with the Water Authority for Wilkinsburg and all of the other communities that it services. And as a ratepayer, I wasn't aware of the news that, particularly in my community, in addition to, I want to say 6 others, that we have recently had increasing numbers with lead poisoning. I have a 2-year-old daughter, which, after listening to the presentations with Yana and Suzanne, those are alarming things for me. I don't want something as simple as the water that we're drinking at our home to be damaging to her or even to myself. As a mom and a woman who is of childbearing age, to know that these things have such a long-term impact, it's really frustrating. And it also makes me think too, when there was the big, public issue with the Flint water crisis, people just automatically assume like, oh, that's just happening there. And it's not. It's happening in communities across this country. And so I think it's really important for us to amplify this information of what isn't happening. Most recently, we have been able to sit down and have a meeting with the executive director of the Wilkinsburg Penn Joint Water Authority. And although it's encouraging to be able to at least get to that first step to begin having conversations, what you oftentimes recognize when you sit into these rooms and you get in these spaces to speak with people who can do something about it is they are pushing. There was a point that Yana had just made in her presentation about some of the false narratives about lead, whether they say, well, it's just not the lead, sometimes it's paint. And I think it's, unfair and that they can just push that perspective or turn a blind eye to it. And so when you apply pressure from the community and from organizers that do this work every single day, for me, I consider myself simply, like you said, a community advocate. I don't have all the answers when it comes to how to fix it, but when you can connect with, people like you, Taylor, and Ann, who we've been working with, and Yana and Suzanne, the folks who literally dig into the work and give the answers and options of how we do this right. And then you hear a leader like Will, who just explained, it's not good enough to just follow what the regulatory standards are. And it's unfortunate that regulatory standards aren't good enough. The regulatory standard should be the standard of the water should be clean and the water should be safe. It shouldn't be you just replace the street to the home and not from the or to the sidewalk, not from the sidewalk to the home. Those are problems that, shouldn't be considered regulatory. Well, as long as you do that, it's okay. No, because the water still isn't safe. It still isn't clean for communities to consume. So I think it's really important that we continue to talk about this issue. And if I'm honest, my experiences with my neighbors hasn't even gotten to the point of the lead. It's something like, I'm struggling with paying my bill. My water authority doesn't even have an option for, a payment plan. People are still dealing with this pandemic that we're in. And so to just assume that because people want to go back to what life was before, it's just not the reality. People are still unemployed. People are still trying to figure out issues of childcare. When we talk about childcare and you're sending your kid to school or to their daycare, what are the what are the barriers that they're facing to make sure that the water in their facilities are also clean? It's not just a home issue, it's the businesses that are providing care and services to our residents. And so, we just got to keep talking about it. And the American Rescue Plan money that is coming through is great, but it shouldn't just be money for the American Rescue Plan. This should be standard. These are issues that we always are going to need water. So, I feel like we've made a first step with the meetings, but it requires a lot of the community to apply pressure to make people recognize that we're not going to be quiet just because you were able to give us a Band-Aid of a situation. So we just can't stop.
Thank you, Ashley. It's so powerful to hear, the work that's being done and the hope for the future. And I'm really sensing a common theme from, all the way from Latricia's keynote through the last panel to now about this need to be kind of uncompromising. And when we think about children's health and environmental justice, that we shouldn't be willing to accept halfway solutions or watered down proposals. And so thank you for your dedication to make sure that happens, and emphasis on the fact that water is life and that it's something that you shouldn't have to worry about, as well as the need for, investment improvement in water authorities beyond just lead poisoning prevention, and how that's connected to the need to change like both our physical infrastructure about water authorities, but also their organizational infrastructure, because it's all leading into one or the other. So yes, the connection between the billing processes to how does someone treat you at the front desk to how do I know how to answer a question or get information from a staff is all connected. So thank you for stringing that together. Awesome. So at this point, let's bring everybody back together. Hi, Suzanne and Will and Yana. Perfect. So thank you all for bringing your unique expertise, but also common interest and dedication to making sure that the water coming from our taps and the water we're cooking with is not harming us. And so I wanted to kind of jump off of points that were already being made earlier related to, this need to collaboratively build strong, effective solutions. And, I know that, Suzanne, you talked about how there are some even toothless natures of like the federal lead and copper rule and the need to like push for full lead service lines, even when that regulation doesn't exist at a federal level. So when we think about these like gaps and needs for better policies, what would you all suggest as like action steps for people who might be tuning in right now on how to advocate for better policies, whether that be internally in their own water system and their commitment to doing certain practices at a state level or even a federal level? So it's a really big question. Feel free to take it in whatever direction you want, but I think it'd be really good to hear from each of you about what kind of action you would recommend to listeners to ensure better, more protective policies.
I can start, but I'd also really want to make sure we hear from Yana, who is not only an expert on this matter, but is also a local activist. I want to encourage everybody that a lot can be done. And in fact, the only changes we have seen at the federal and the local level, I shouldn't say the only, the major changes we have seen have been because of advocacy by local advocates. Unfortunately, some major changes have come in places only because of lawsuits that have been brought. But it's really not just the lawsuits. What has happened, change has come when there has been media attention on the issue. And that has happened when activists get together and push for changes. And Flint arose out of activism. I mean, it was about doctors and, local people who knew there was something wrong with their water. Unfortunately, the lead and copper rule is a failure, and that's why we have to push for change. So just like this, with all of you getting together, you push, you put demand change from your local government and from your water boards. And on the federal level, people like Yana and me, we work with local advocates all around the country. And we push for change, and we have had a lot of attention from EPA lately about really listening to community activists, setting up roundtables in communities. So I encourage you to reach out to people like Yana and me, and we will work with you. We can often provide support, but the goal is always for your voices to be heard and to be first, because you are the ones living through what's going on in your community. So definitely don't feel powerless. You have a lot of power here to make some change.
Yeah, I very much agree, seconding what Suzanne just said. And it's really true when you look at the history of lead in drinking water, that the fact that we're even acknowledging today that lead in drinking water actually poses a health risk to human health is really the result of dogged work by affected and poisoned communities that goes all the way back to at least the 1980s and even way before. The one thing that I'd like to say is that after the Flint water crisis, that the state of Michigan passed its own lead and copper rule, which is far from perfect. but it is the country's most stringent lead and copper rule today. And one of the provisions in Michigan's regulation is that medium-sized and large water utilities are required to have community advisory groups that meet regularly to work with water utilities and to steer water utilities in a public health protective direction. And so I think that for all of us that looking at the Michigan Lead and Copper Rule and seeing how we can bring it into our own communities might be helpful. Because at the end of the day, what is happening right now is, and I think Suzanne, you mentioned it earlier, is that the Lead and Copper Rule really allows for systematic misinformation about lead in water and deception, public deception about how prevalent lead in water is and what risks it actually poses to human health and what harm it has been doing to fetuses, infants, young children, and really everybody else. So I think that in going for the uncompromising stance that Taylor, as you mentioned, is the common thread from panel to panel, I think that part of the uncompromising stance that we can adopt is to say the systematic institutional deception that is legitimized and allowed under the Lead and Copper Rule has got to stop. It has got to come to an end. And these types of community advisory panels and certainly activism on the local and national level can be very helpful. And as Suzanne said, Suzanne and I and many of the people we work with on the national level are available at all times to help and support your local efforts.
And I can go ahead and chime in from the utility perspective. First, I think Suzanne and Jana and Taylor, I know you've lived and breathed this. I think PWSA really has benefited from community engagement. From the minute that I started in my role at PWSA working on public affairs, the advocacy from the community and even out-of-town experts supporting has really pushed the authority to do the right thing in a lot of respects with lead and water and our response to it. It's difficult to say, had there not been that engagement, where we would be today. Like I said, we have a program that goes over and beyond the regulatory expectations. And with that, support and that dogged commitment to doing what is right and not compromising, I think there also has to be a realistic conversation about resources. And I'm excited about the discussion of federal funding specifically being earmarked for lead service line replacements. We don't have it yet. There is some funding, but we have had subsequent, successive line of rate increases that have largely been driven by our lead service line replacement program. And so when we talk about the cost of these programs, especially absent a large federal investment, that's an area where we also need advocates to be able to defend that investment because it does cost ratepayers. And that's, at PWSA, I think we've done a good job of pairing that with assistance programs for those who aren't able to afford our water and sewer rates as they stand now. So I think that is a component of it. And another way, put some perspective on, the lead and copper rule and the obligations. PWSA is probably a medium-sized utility if you look at us nationally. We didn't have the resources in place to be able to meet the inventory requirements, the actual construction program that was required to replace the lead lines, and then developing the communications and public engagement that we needed. That in itself is, us as a medium utility, we were able to figure it out. We didn't meet the initial deadlines and we paid a penalty for not being able to do that. But if you look at some of the smaller utilities and the fragmented nature of, especially here in Western Pennsylvania, you have utilities that don't have the resources and may not have the ability to easily increase rates to get those resources, that we need to be looking for support from state and federal government to get that to them, whether it's technical support, whether it's cash in terms of grant funding. That's an area where there's a tremendous amount of need. we as an organization at PWSA are really proud of our efforts to try to educate our local and other utilities nationally about what we've done, what's worked, what hasn't. But I think they're, as people rightly so start to focus on lead, providing support to those utilities so they have the resources to meet the public's expectations is going to be critical. And then a final point, and this might be a little too in the weeds, but I talked about how we needed the change in state law to make it clear that we could invest the dollars on private property. There are other changes at the margins that I think if we could clarify that maybe we don't need as many legal agreements to enter into a home and replace that private lead service line. That is an extremely labor-intensive process. Not every homeowner wants to sign an agreement to let the utility in their home. I mentioned public trust. It's still an issue with many of our customers. So if there's more we can do within the regulatory framework to allow us to expedite and make it easier for us to do the right thing, that will also save the utility dollars, which we can put toward more replacements, and it'll allow us to continue to remove that risk from the area that we're responsible for, which are those lead service lines. And I'd be remiss in terms of scoping for PWSA. Our latest estimates believe that we have about 8,000 public lead service lines remaining. We have approximately 80,000 service connections. So in terms of lead service lines, and we talked earlier about how that's not the only source of lead in drinking water, it is not every customer within our service territory has a lead service line, and I just think that was important to note.
Well, thank you for that, Will. And I think the perspective that I really want to give is oftentimes I think people hear about these conversations and they feel like they don't know enough. They feel like because maybe they're not aware of what necessary steps need to be taken, that they don't know how to use their voice to speak up on what isn't right. And, like what Yana said and Suzanne said, in communities across this country, there are people that are literally just focused on this work. And if you just feel like, hey, this doesn't feel right, reach out to them. A lot of times in the grassroots space and in that work that organizers and activists are doing, it takes people. And the more people that you have, the more noise you can make. Suzanne, I believe, said it when the Flint water crisis happened. That wasn't because the people who were in the positions of power said, oh, let's do it. Let's do the right thing. No, it was a group of people who said, my kids aren't well. My family isn't well. I'm not able to have children. Things didn't add up. And so what you do when you just know, oftentimes it's like, well, how do you know? Lived experiences make you the expert of what needs to happen. And we have to feel confident in that, or finding someone that you feel like, well, maybe I'm nervous to say it, but I'm going to call this person or reach out to this person because this isn't right, and move on it. We don't have to feel like when we come into these spaces that we have to have all the answers. And to the points that I said this to Taylor before we went to have our meeting with the folks at the Wilkinsburg Penn Joint. I said to her, it was really encouraging to be on a call with someone like Will, who is operating a water authority, who is open, who is listening, who is able to say, you know what, we didn't get that right, but we're going to fix it. We're going to see what we can do to change it. And those are the kind of people that we need to see in different positions. So whether it's your local elected official, whether it's your, state official, if you are talking to people who feel like they aren't open to the perspective that you're bringing, those aren't the people that we need to be leading us, because they're not passionate enough about what it is that the people they're supposed to be representing care about, what matters to them, and their livelihood. We're not talking about a luxury. We're talking about water. We're talking about something that if you don't have it, it could be a detriment to your home, your household, your life. And it's not something that we can just say, oh, well, I did my best. No, like we cannot accept, I tried. It's just not good enough.
Thank you for that, Ashley. And I think that at least what I have witnessed, right, in our more recent conversations with like other water authorities within the county, with Ashley leading the way there, is just trying to make things that are unknown and explaining that they're feasible. And it's not, and because there's sometimes this assumption that the unknown is impossible or it's too difficult or it's just not the way we've done things, right? And so the standard practice up until recently was, you know, we're legally responsible to replace pipes up until your curb or to your sidewalk, and then we leave. And now that we have this science that's saying, oh, that's actually a really bad idea, and it might even be better to just leave everything alone than to do that partial replacement, it's time to like revisit those old ways and find new ways of doing it. And I think the role of these advocates, at least from my perspective, has been seeing the water authorities kind of be more open to these ideas when you do take the time to explain how things can be feasible step by step. And related to that, and connected to a question we had in the chat about what are these community advisory groups. We've talked about them generally so far about, you know, having oversight, providing input to water authorities, but who sits on those? How do they operate? And like what power do they have to directly influence the authority? Or is it recommendations that are just sort of shared and then thank you and we've accepted them? So how does that, what do those power dynamics look like? And then who would be sitting on those advisory committees? I don't know if it makes sense to start with perhaps Will, if you wanted to describe like who sits on the community-led response advisory committee, that would be maybe a good start.
Happy to, Taylor. So we do have what we call the Community-Led Response Advisory Committee that meets, I believe, at a minimum on a quarterly basis, and we've been able to leverage that group to help validate. I think that the major policy discussion and issue we had is, okay, we have now funding available. We have a sense of where the lead lines are. Who gets the replacement first? And, how do we weight the likelihood of us going into a neighborhood and finding a lot of lead lines, which from a construction point of view is less costly and potentially less disruptive, versus do you focus on areas that have a higher likelihood of populations at risk? So younger families, children under 6. And so we did work with that advisory committee to help create that metric. And I believe Dan Duffy is going to go into some of that in his presentation later today. But our advisory committee is made up of representatives from Pittsburgh United. Taylor, your very own Michelle from WE sits on that, as well as representatives from University of Pittsburgh's Public Health. And we are a regulated utility by the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. So representatives from the PUC also participate. And then Pittsburgh United has brought additional expertise from NRDC and other stakeholder groups to that table. And it's been a successful program. I think it's a really good way for us to make sure that we're in alignment with the community. And, in full disclosure, our advisory committee was something we committed to as part of a rate case with the PUC. So it was something that we agreed, but it's a requirement at this stage. But there's nothing stopping a utility from creating an advisory committee like that with members of the community, technical experts locally and nationally to help guide that discussion. And I will say early on, PWSA did have some advisory committees that were purely voluntary. And if advocates or engaged folks who are listening in are wondering if it'll be hard to find people like that, good people like Suzanne and Yana, I think they've already volunteered up some of their expertise. But if you are able to reach out to people, they will help at least steer you in the right direction, because this is an issue that everybody in the industry, whether it's public health or water, is really interested in. So I would say our CLEAR-AC is I'm using acronyms. The lead advisory group is a really good starting place. And if anyone wants to reach out to me to find out who is on that, there's information about it on our lead website, lead.pgh20.com. But happy to provide more insight and guidance if you want to stand up something similar in your community.
Thank you, Will. I don't know if, Jana, is there anything you would add from even the Michigan perspective and the advisory committee that they created, or is that slightly different than the one we're referring to within water authorities?
I mean, I think that the questions that you raised, Taylor, before about who's going to be on these advisory committees and how exactly would they work, is of critical importance, because as I think probably we all know that all sorts of committees can be created that sound really good, and that at the end of the day either do not promote a public health perspective or have no teeth to affect change. And so I think that that's really the key here, is how to be creating these advisory committees that can have an effect. And the one thing I was looking at and trying to respond to one question, if that's okay, to go ahead, about what can residents do if their water utility continues to convince or blame customers that customer plumbing is to blame for lead water contamination. First of all, when it comes to lead water, as we now know, of course, lead service lines are a key source of that, and lead service lines are in many cases public property. They're owned by cities or water utilities. But despite that, customers, residents, really, I don't think ever choose to buy and install plumbing that has lead in it. And in fact, customers and residents have not weighed in on EPA's decision to allow lead to continue to be added to brand new plumbing while this plumbing is labeled lead-free. So that's, again, part of the deception that I think Suzanne was talking about before. And moreover, the release of lead into the water is directly connected to the water's chemistry. Although there are additional factors that can cause lead to leach into the water aside from chemistry, water chemistry is really, really crucial in this whole formula. So to argue that lead in water is ever to blame on community members, I think just doesn't agree with the science. And I think it's intellectually dishonest. I also think that it is morally indefensible. And so we really need to be moving beyond the blaming of the victim space that we are in I think many jurisdictions around the country, and really to be looking at this as a public health problem that really, if only residents knew the truth about, would be far better able to protect themselves today.
Thank you for that, Jana. Really important points. We have another question in the chat that I want to make sure we get to. That's, to what extent have the vulnerable community members, those living in these communities that are affected, been involved in local efforts? So I don't know if, Ashley, you wanted to take this as like kind of the most recent organizing efforts happening in Wilkinsburg Penn Joint. That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think with any kind of work, when you're talking about organizing and advocacy, oftentimes the people who are most involved or most impacted aren't tapped in on this side, because they've got other things going on in their lives, like that, yes, they want their water to be clean, but they just have other issues, other things within their life that they have to focus on. So in this example, when this was starting to happen, the organizing for the Wilkinsburg Penn Joint Water Authority, someone just reached out to me just because they know I live in the area, and they know, like, well, let me call Ashley because I know Ashley will say something or Ashley will show up. And when you do get when the people who are organizing get the opportunity to find someone directly impacted in the community, then I can tap into other people. I literally, the day after we had a meeting, had a business owner within my community call me and say, hey, I'm having an issue with the water authority. I said, wow, like I was just there yesterday. I'm going to connect you with the people I've been working with. We're going to start to push, because until you hear about it, until someone actually, it's that community trust, they find someone that they're comfortable with speaking to or know that they can call on. It's hard. And that's why, to the point, the one question that Yana just answered about the company blaming the customers. And it's like, I don't believe you. Like, how are you blaming me? But you're the one that's supposed to be doing this work. So if it's my fault, then why wasn't there a regulation to make sure that I didn't do what was wrong? So there's always a way to, in my opinion, put it back on the party that's responsible, because everybody else is out here trying to live and thrive and be their best day to day. And with the economy and the spaces that we're currently living in, it's hard. So having things like this and being able to tap into other communities. And when you go out, someone like me, just because I'm involved within my community, if we're knocking on doors and talking to people, this kind of stuff just comes up. I was out knocking on doors whenever the moratorium was about to end for the water authority, and literally had a neighbor tell me, like, I can't afford this bill. I'm still not working, but they're going to come and shut off my water because there is no option for a payment plan. That's a problem. It's something that we know doesn't have to be that way, but because the people in positions of power that are, and it's a private business, so they do have the luxury of doing what they want, we've got to push this conversation. We've got to find the Taylors and the Yanas and the Suzannes who are dedicated to this work every single day, so that they can help to guide best practice for how to tackle these issues. And so anyone who's watching this, I should say, who has a care, call somebody, because they're going to bring you in. No one doing the work to fight against this is going to be like, we don't need you. They're going to say, oh my goodness, come. Do you know someone else? And that's how it's been since I've gotten involved with Taylor and Ann and the countless other people when we started this meeting with the Water Authority, because word of mouth, in my opinion, is kind of the best way to push this. And also for me as a millennial, I said this in the meeting with the executive director, because we were talking about, things that they're doing and how are you informing your ratepayers. And, we mentioned something as simple as social media, like to an older generation, maybe that's just not first thought, and that's okay. But that's also why you have to have conversations with community members, because my exact words to him was, millennials are turning 40. We are not 20, we are turning 40 now. And so you're not doing your best to reach the people who are impacted by this, to make sure that they have all the information that they can get, so they can make the best choices for themselves. They know how to send a bill. They know how to send you a late notice, but they don't know how to make sure you know what steps you can take to help them do their job better. They don't want to do it better. They want to just operate how they want to operate.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And I think that is probably a perfect point to end on. And so I want to thank all four of you for your time today, for your work in preparing this, and for the work and progress that you're making every single day to help protect communities and advance equity when it comes to lead safe water.